7 cities of gold. A ruler who eats from golden plates and sleeps beneath a tree hung with thousands of tiny golden bells. They sway in the wind and lull him to sleep through the hot afternoons. The dogs are fed from silver bowls. A river 10 kilometers wide, teeming with fish the size of war horses. Boats with 20 oarsmen on each side, sails billowing, and on every prow an eagle cast from solid gold. Streets of goldsmiths in each of the 7 cities. That is what the man the Spanish called El Turco told them. Cities of gold. Sounds like bait for fools, you might think, but this was no abstraction, no fairy tale whispered to children. In those days everyone talked about them. Spaniards, Indians, merchants in Seville, sailors in the ports. Somewhere out there they existed, in the Amazon basin, deep in the jungle, beyond the mountains, beyond the desert. Always beyond something. The Spanish were first. First in South America, first in Central America, first in Mexico. You think it is a coincidence that from Mexico to Argentina people speak Spanish? It is not. It is the conquista. Entire continents before the English so much as set foot in Virginia. When we think of the conquest of the Americas, our minds probably go to the Incas, the Aztecs, Cortés marching into Tenochtitlan with a handful of men, or Pizarro, who with an even smaller handful toppled an empire stretching across half a continent. And the gold from there, it flowed. It genuinely flowed by ship, by the ton into Seville, and everybody knew it. But after those conquests, something else began stirring in the Americas. On the ruins of the Aztecs and the Incas, a new empire was rising, New Spain, growing, spilling outward in every direction. And the Spanish realized that to the north an entire continent still waited, vast, unexplored, and that they would be first. Not the French, not the English, not the Portuguese, only them. And if the south held the gold of the Aztecs and the Incas, why should the north be any different? Drop a comment with your thoughts. Would North America have been a better place under Spanish rule instead of British? I have noticed lately that we have been running some intensely serious topics. Fascinating, sure, but short on adventure. And I started this channel precisely to tell stories like this one. Obscure, full of absurdities and plot twists. So today we go back to our roots. From Mexico City, an army marches north. 300 Spaniards in gleaming armor, over 1,000 Indian allies, banners snapping in the wind, herds of cattle, artillery strapped to mules. The largest overland expedition ever launched in New Spain. It is led by a 30-year-old governor who has mortgaged his wife's fortune, 70,000 pesos in gold. The Viceroy has matched the sum from his own pocket. Combined, 19 tons of silver converted into men, horses, weapons, and provisions. The crown did not contribute a single coin. A year later, those same men stand in the middle of the prairie, filthy, starving, crawling with lice, grass up to their waists in every direction, not a single tree in sight. The only landmarks on that sea of green are piles of bison bones they have stacked themselves to find their way back to camp. Because after the army passes through, the grass straightens up as though no one has ever touched it. And the man who promised them all of this, El Turco, is in chains. The 1530s. Barely 20 years have passed since Cortés walked into Tenochtitlan, the city on water with marketplaces, where more people traded than at any fair in Europe, and then razed it to the ground. On the ruins of the Aztec capital, a new city is rising. Mexico, Spanish, Christian, packed with churches built from stones ripped out of temples. I was in Mexico a few years ago, saw those churches, and it always fills me with sadness when I think about the architectural wonders we lost, and how easy it is to erase a civilization and everything it built in the space of a few years. But back to the story. Silver flows to Seville on ships that export more every year than the year before. Charles V rules an empire on which the sun never sets. Well before the British, the Spanish could already claim that slogan. In New Spain, the colossal colony the Spanish built on the ruins of the Aztecs, stretching from today's Mexico to Guatemala, with its capital in the old Tenochtitlan, men walk around staring north, thinking, there is a second Tenochtitlan out there, a second Cuzco, another empire ripe for the taking, another treasury to plunder. And you have to grasp this. Every one of those men has heard of Cortés, not from a textbook, not from a grandfather's tale. 20 years earlier he was nobody, a minor bureaucrat in Cuba, and then he took the Aztec Empire with a handful of men, captured their ruler Moctezuma, and became one of the richest men alive. And 7 years ago, Pizarro did the same thing on the other side of the continent. With an even smaller handful, he crushed the Incas, seized their ruler Atahualpa, and squeezed from him a ransom that to this day has no equal. A room filled with gold and silver to the ceiling, tons of precious metal shipped to Spain. Every conquistador looked at that and thought one thing: there must be another such ruler, another empire for the taking. And you cannot judge these men through the lens of the 21st century, sitting with a laptop and an oat milk latte, hogging a cafe table for hours. These were people for whom the only way up was risk that sounds like madness today. Conquista, or spend the rest of your life raising a goat in Extremadura. That belief did not come from nowhere. Nuño de Guzman, president of the First Audiencia, the colonial Supreme Court, a man brutal even by the standards of a brutal era, had an Indian slave named Tejo from the Oxitipar Valley. Tejo testified under questioning that as a boy he had traveled with his father to the north, 40 days' march through grassless desert, to 7 great cities, where goldsmiths sat in the streets and the houses rose several stories high. Guzman believed him, set out northward. Tejo died on the way, but the story survived. A few years later, 4 men stumbled out of the desert, ragged, emaciated, barely alive, the only survivors of Panfilo de Narvaez's expedition to Florida, an expedition that had set out 8 years earlier with over 300 men and 50 horses. 3 Spaniards and 1 Moor, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, treasurer of the Narvaez expedition, who over 8 years had been, in turn, a captive, a shaman, a trader, and a wanderer among peoples whose existence no one in Madrid suspected. Andrés Dorantes and Alonso del Castillo Maldonado, the 2 other Spaniards, about whom the chronicles say little, and Estevanico, Esteban de Dorantes, a slave from Azemmour in Morocco, dark-skinned, Arabic-speaking. He spoke at least 6 Indian languages and knew the sign language of the plains. He served as healer and intermediary between worlds that had nothing in common. He carried with him 2 Castilian greyhounds. Those dogs will have their role to play yet. Cabeza de Vaca returned to Mexico and talked. About peoples to the north, about cities beyond the desert. Except when you read closely what he actually said, he is talking about villages. About a copper bell someone showed him, with a face carved into it. The Indians claimed it came from the north, where there was plenty of copper, which they valued highly. About pearls along the Pacific shore. No golden cities. No Cuzco. Mexico heard something else. Mexico heard golden cities. The old legend of the 7 cities of Cibola suddenly had an address. Castaneda, the soldier who wrote the most comprehensive chronicle of this expedition, 2 decades after the fact, noted that when Cabeza de Vaca and Dorantes spoke in the capital, people heard about an immensely great city. They heard what they wanted to hear. Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza, a cautious politician and no fool, decided to verify. He purchased Estevanico from Dorantes for somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 pesos, and sent him north alongside a Franciscan, Fray Marcos de Niza. Marcos had an official mission: go see, confirm or deny. Estevanico rode ahead, several days' march in front of the friar, with a group of Indian interpreters. And that is where the trouble started. Estevanico reached the Zunis, Indians who lived in adobe and stone villages called pueblos in the territory of present-day New Mexico. There were 7 of those villages, and the largest was called Hawiku. He died there. The circumstances are a mess, a big mess. Many versions, but we need to go through them. Fray Marcos wrote in his report that Estevanico sent a messenger bearing a gourd rattle adorned with feathers, 1 red and 1 white, and the chief of Hawiku hurled that rattle to the ground and declared that if those people came to his village, they would all die. Estevanico ignored the warning. The next morning he tried to flee. They killed him. Coronado, more on him shortly, he is the one who will lead the great expedition, put it more bluntly in a letter to the Viceroy. The Zunis killed Estevan because he was a bad man who assaulted their women. Castaneda told it differently again, claimed they held him prisoner for 3 days and interrogated him before killing him. He had demanded turquoise and women. Alarcon, the captain of 2 ships meant to support the later expedition from the sea, heard from Indians along the Colorado about a black-bearded man who wore things that jingled, bells and feathers on his feet and arms. None of these versions agrees with any other. Beneath all of it lies a layer that is mentioned too rarely. The rattle Estevanico carried was decorated with owl feathers. In the Zuni belief system, the owl is a symbol of dark magic, of death. A dark-skinned giant with a beard appears at your pueblo, the first such person anyone in the village has ever seen, announces that a great army follows behind him, demands turquoise and women, and holds an object that in your culture signifies a curse. The Zunis reacted rationally. They reacted the way any people would react when an armed stranger arrives and demands women. They eliminated a scout of a foreign invasion force. Part of his entourage, Castaneda mentions about 60 people, was released, which suggests a deliberate military decision, not a spontaneous act of violence, but a calculation. Incidentally, proof of the cultural shock Estevanico's appearance caused is that the Zunis and Hopi to this day have a figure in their ceremonies called Chakwaina, a spirit kachina, a being from their ceremonial world, black, bearded, with terrifying teeth. Some ethnographers see Estevanico in it, others disagree. Fray Marcos de Niza learns that Estevanico is dead and turns back. He returns to Mexico and tells the Viceroy that he saw Cibola from a distance, that it gleamed in the sun, that it is bigger than Mexico. Hundreds of people will pay for those words. Hallenbeck, the historian who essentially devoted half his career to demolishing Marcos's reputation, called him outright a lying friar, and his report a masterwork of fabrication. The Flints, Richard and Shirley Cushing Flint, probably the most thorough pair of researchers on this expedition, whose collected documents from the Coronado expedition fill a weighty volume from which I am pulling half these quotations, offered a compromise. Marcos probably reached some elevation and glimpsed some pueblo from a great distance, but then wrote a report containing elements of diplomatic strategy. He wrote what his sponsor expected to hear. And one more name, Cortés himself, yes, that Cortés, noted of Marcos, "The said Fray Marcos does not newly lie, for he has done so many times, and it was his habit, as is commonly known in the provinces of Peru and Guatemala." Marcos had previously accompanied Pizarro. More precisely, no, he was present at the execution of Atahualpa. Execution is too gentle a word for what happened there. This was no naive monk fresh from a cloister. This was a man who had seen how the conquista worked, what it cost, and what it yielded. He knew what Mendoza wanted to hear. One way or another, he came back, said what he said, and New Spain went into a frenzy. The chronicler Suarez de Peralta, a descendant of conquistadors, son of one of Cortés's knights, recorded that a license to join the Cibola expedition was treated like a title of nobility. Mendoza needed someone to lead the army, someone young, ambitious, and above all, wealthy. Francisco Vazquez de Coronado, 30 years old, a second son, disinherited. Years earlier, the right of primogeniture, the rule that the firstborn inherits the entire estate, stripped him of his legacy. Everything went to his older brother, Gonzalo. He had sailed to New Spain in the entourage of Viceroy Mendoza. Coronado's father had served under Mendoza's father in Granada, so the connection was old, almost familial, driven not by a thirst for adventure, but by the spectre of downward mobility. A calculated marriage to Beatriz de Estrada, daughter of the royal treasurer of New Spain, gave him wealth. The encomienda of Talapa, an assigned Indian community obligated to pay tribute and labor for its owner, the third largest in all of New Spain. Governor of Nueva Galicia from the autumn of 1538. This was no desperate soldier without a penny. This was a man who had something to lose, and he put it all on one bet. Sounds like the guy who takes out a second mortgage on crypto because this time it will definitely work out. Coronado mortgaged his wife's fortune for 70,000 pesos in gold coin. Mendoza chipped in from his own pocket. The chronicles mention 60,000. The royal crown did not contribute a single peso. The classic model of private conquista under royal patent, the entire investment on the shoulders of two men. February of 1540, Compostela, the western coast of Mexico. I have to pause here because Castaneda described the departure, and even through the words of a chronicler writing 2 decades later, you feel the scale. Monday, the 23rd of February. Mendoza delivered a farewell address. Every soldier swore obedience to the commander and pledged to prove himself a loyal vassal of his Lord King. And then they marched. Castaneda. When all set out the following morning in properly ordered companies, with banners flying, more than 1,000 servants and attendants, black and red, went with them, leading spare horses, driving pack animals, carrying the additional baggage of their masters, or herding the great droves of larger and smaller cattle. Over 1,000 horses, mules loaded with supplies, 6 swivel-mounted harquebuses, portable cannons that could be rotated in any direction, hundreds of oxen, cows, sheep, banners in the wind, the flash of metal in the winter sun, Coronado in gilded armor with a plumed helmet, so Bolton reports, standing out among the hidalgos, the minor nobility without estates, like a target at a shooting range, and somewhere at the back, among the Franciscans, Fray Marcos de Niza, the guide to the city he supposedly saw. Over the next 6 months, that army will slowly fall apart. The Sonoran Desert. Castaneda describes it as a wilderness utterly dead, where horses perished for want of forage, and men starved, eating weeds from old huts. 30 days of marching between Chichilticali, a ruined adobe house that served as a landmark, and Cibola. Heat so fierce that the metal of armor burns the skin through the padded jacket beneath. No water, sand, rocks, scraggly vegetation. The cattle herds cannot keep pace with the column because cows do not walk as fast as horses. The food falls behind, and hunger rides up front. Soldiers eat cactus fruit. They chew raw herbs because nothing else is available. Jaramillo, captain of the vanguard and the second most important chronicler after Castaneda, recorded it tersely, and that terseness is worse than melodrama. One of the soldiers, a Spaniard named Espinosa, dies after eating poisonous plants, alongside 2 other people, from poisonous plants they ate, on account of the great want in which they found themselves. That is all. I do not know why, but that death moves me more than the hundreds burned later. Maybe because Espinosa has a name, and the others do not. Later, the main body of the army, trailing behind, found his bones beside the desert path, gnawed by scavengers. In March, before the desert even began, Lope de Samaniego died, commander of the camp guard, the expedition's first fatality, an Indian arrow in Chiametla on the Pacific coast. That man survived the preparations, the inspection, the departure, weeks on the road, and died from a single arrow before the expedition had properly begun. Coronado could not wait for the rest. In late April, he left Culiacan with the vanguard, roughly 75 horsemen and a handful of foot soldiers, and pushed ahead. He needs to see Cibola. He needs to see what he has staked everything on. The vanguard climbs onto the plateau. In the valley below them lies a city. The 7th of July, 1540, Hawiku. Castaneda. When they saw the first pueblo, which was Cibola, some hurled such curses at Fray Marcos as God forbid should come true. He added that the pueblo is a small village, unfairly named by the Father Provincial. Even from the 20-year distance at which he wrote those words, you feel the disappointment that on that day must have pressed their stomachs into their throats. Instead of golden towers, multi-story buildings of sun-dried clay, sandstone, and stone. On a narrow ridge, 7 residential blocks enclosing an irregular plaza, walls plastered with mortar, roofs of pine timber, branches, and reeds. Beautiful in a stark sort of way. Archaeologists from the Hodge excavations in the 1920s counted hundreds of rooms, but not golden, not in the slightest. The Zunis did not greet them with bread. Before the assault, the Spanish, because such was the law, formally read the requerimiento. This needs explaining because it is one of the most absurd legal procedures in the history of colonialism. The requerimiento was a legal document from 1513 that had to be read aloud to every encountered people before force could be used. It contained a history of the world from creation, Spain's rights to the Indies granted by the Pope, and a demand for submission to the king and conversion to Christianity. It was read in Spanish, translated into a language the interpreter probably half understood, to people behind walls who understood nothing at all. Heat, dust, 300 men on their feet, hungry, exhausted after months of marching, in armor baked by the sun. And from the Pueblo walls the Zunis look down and respond, if we trust the account, that they did not know His Highness, nor did they wish to be his vassals, nor to serve him, nor any other Christian. That is a sentence that belongs in a museum. The assault. Coronado attacks in person, and credit where it is due, the man was no coward. The Zunis defend from rooftops and walls, hurling stones down. Coronado, in that ornamental plumed helmet that marks him like a bullseye, takes a stone to the head. Twice. He himself reported it in a letter to the Viceroy. They knocked me to the ground with countless stones cast from above, and had I not been protected by a very good helmet, I think it would have gone badly for me. Castaneda adds, an arrow through the foot, bruises on arms and legs, and the Zunis aimed at him, for he was recognizable among all, that gilded armor. He lies beneath the walls. Were it not for Garcia Lopez de Cardenas, the officer who shielded his commander with his own body, and Hernando de Alvarado, who did the same, Coronado would have died on day 1 at Cibola. Remember that Cardenas. And the harquebusiers and crossbowmen? The harquebus was a heavy firearm, ancestor of the musket, on paper a crushing advantage over bows and slings. Coronado reported bitterly, they could do nothing, having arrived so weakened after months of desert that they could barely stand. The crossbowmen had snapped all their strings on the march. The Pueblo falls. The Zunis withdraw to Toyalane, Thunder Mesa, a flat, steep-sided hill with a single approach up a narrow path. Such natural fortresses and mesas, a defining feature of the southwestern landscape. Mountains sliced flat on top like a table. Coronado rode up there a few days later and came back the same day. The Zunis had no intention of fighting in the open. The Spanish find in the Pueblo what they actually need: corn, beans, turkeys, food, not gold. Coronado writes to the Viceroy, "These provinces are a very small affair. There is no gold here nor any other metal in this land." He does not turn back. 70,000 pesos, his wife's fortune, his reputation. And it is easy to say, stupidity, greed, he should have turned around. But try returning to Mexico after 2 months of marching through desert, with nothing, and telling your wife her fortune is gone, and the Viceroy that his 60,000 pesos bought corn and beans in a mud village. These people did not have an option called, I will try something else. So Coronado does what people do when they have invested too much to quit. He doubles down. He sends side expeditions in every direction. Pedro de Tovar rides west to the Hopi, returns with news of a great river somewhere to the north. Coronado sends Cardenas. Cardenas rides west with 12 or 13 soldiers, Hopi guides and supplies for 20 days. The guides lead them over the roughest terrain imaginable. There is a hypothesis they did so deliberately. And after 20 days of marching, an edge. The Grand Canyon. Castaneda, who was not there himself, reported secondhand. They saw a gorge roughly 16 to 22 kilometers wide, and the river at the bottom appeared to be 2 handspans across, 40 centimeters. In reality, the Colorado there is over 100 meters wide, but from the canyon rim the scale is so enormous that the human brain cannot process distance. Cardenas sent the 3 lightest men down. They climbed for hours, came back, could not manage it, made it 1/3 of the way. And they said the rocks that from above looked about man height turned out at the bottom to be larger than the Great Tower of Seville. The Giralda stood 82 meters tall at the time. Cardenas reported back, a great chasm, useless. For over 2 centuries no European will return here. 82 meters. Men who descended 1/3 of the way said rocks that looked like pebbles from above turned out to be bigger than a cathedral. And Cardenas came back to Hauiku and wrote 1 word in his report: useless. I sometimes wonder what he would say if he knew that 400 years later people would pay money to stare at that useless chasm. Meanwhile, another expedition went east, Hernando de Alvarado, with 23 horsemen towards the Rio Grande. He found the Tiguej pueblos, 12, maybe 13 fortified villages, inhabited by the Tiwa people in the river valley, 10 to 20,000 inhabitants, farming beans, corn, cotton, prosperous, peaceful. Alvarado met there a delegation from farther off Pecos, another major pueblo, roughly 150 kilometers to the east. It is led by a man the Spanish call bigotes, mustache, because he has facial hair, which Castaneda noted as an exception among indigenous Americans. Coronado relocates the entire army to Tiguej for the winter. He will winter there, but before that, we need to talk about the man who came from Pecos. They call him El Turco. He wears a cloth on his head resembling a turban, hence the nickname. He is a captive from the Great Plains, held prisoner in Pecos. Who was he? Historians argue, and I will not pretend we know. Most say Pawnee, some say Wichita, someone proposed the mound builders of the lower Mississippi. Nobody knows, and we probably never will. One thing we know, he told stories that drove the Spanish out of their minds. At night, by the fire, he picks up a stick and draws in the sand. Rivers, cities, palaces. Night on the desert, the fire cracking, and this man in chains traces a stick-drawn map to a land that does not exist. And 30 armed men lean over those scratches as if over treasure. Juan de Contreras and Rodrigo de Frias, 2 soldiers who testified in court afterward, remembered exactly those nighttime sessions. Quivira, a ruler called Tatarax who eats from golden plates, dogs fed from silver bowls, a river full of fish the size of horses, boats with golden eagles on their prows, and a tree beneath which Tatarax sleeps, and from whose branches hang golden bells that sway in the wind. And there was someone who from day one said, he is lying. Sopete, also called Isopete, the painted one, a Wichita from Kansas. He knew the territory. He said it plainly. Quivira exists, to the north, not to the east. No gold, no bells. The Spanish ignored him. Before they chase that fairy tale, it is winter. And there is something that must be told, because without it we cannot understand why El Turco had reason to do what he did. The Spanish, over 300 Europeans, over 1,000 allies from Mexico, horses, herds of cattle, descended on the Tiguez pueblos like a plague of locusts. Cárdenas requisitioned the entire pueblo of Cufor, evicted the residents from their homes, and told them to leave their belongings. Soldiers seized 300 mantas, cotton cloaks, because winter along the Rio Grande can be murderous, and the Spanish had no warm clothing. Enormous herds devoured the stores of dried corn stalks, without which the Tiwa could not survive the frost. And here the truly ugly part begins. A soldier named Juan de Villegas, a common foot soldier of no significance, except for what he did, raped a Tiwa woman. Her husband recognized the attacker's horse and came to Coronado with the accusation. Coronado, and the documents from the later investigation are merciless here, refused to investigate, claiming there were no witnesses on the Spanish side. Then Alvarado clapped Bigotes, the mustache from Pecos, in chains and set war dogs on him. The pretext was a golden bracelet that El Turco claimed had been taken from him, a bracelet that probably never existed or was copper. Alvarado wanted gold, so he tortured a man who had come on a peace delegation. The Tiwa responded the only way they could. In December they killed between 40 and 60 horses and mules grazing in the valley. Striking at the horses, that was surgical. Do not attack the armed Spaniards. Take away the thing on which their absolute superiority rests. Coronado declared war. Guerra de fuego y sangre. War of fire and blood. He sent Cárdenas. The Siege of Pueblo Arenal, mid-December. Cárdenas attacks with Europeans and allies from Mexico. Before the assault, the requerimiento is read. Once again, that legal text, that farce in a language nobody behind the walls understands. The answer from Arenal: they did not know His Highness, did not wish to be his vassals. A day and a half of fighting. The allies from Mexico set fire to the ground floor rooms. Smoke forced the defenders out. They raised the sign of the cross. They surrendered. They laid down their weapons. Cardenas had issued an order before the assault: take no one alive. And here I need to say one thing about Cardenas, because it is temptingly easy to make him into a monster. He was not a monster. He was an officer in a 16th century colonial army, doing what officers in 16th century colonial armies did. Cortés burned villages. Pizarro strangled Atahualpa. De Soto tortured chiefs in Florida. Cardenas was no worse than any of them, except that he happened to get caught and put on trial. And that is what infuriates me about this story. Not that Cardenas was brutal, because they all were, but that the system punished individuals to protect the machine. The prisoners, 30 according to Castaneda, over 200 according to Cardenas's own testimony, from a cell in Spain, were brought to his tent. No one informed him they had surrendered voluntarily. He ordered them burned, alive, at the stake. Those who tore themselves from the flames were impaled on lances, cut down with swords. Castaneda. When they saw that the Spaniards did not respect the sign of the cross they had raised in surrender, a despair so great seized them that they beat their own chests. He added that the punishment was unjust, for the guilt did not lie with those punished. Honestly, I do not know what to add. Castaneda described it, and I have nothing smarter to say. The only thing I can do is quote Cardenas's own defense, given under interrogation years later. He did it to spare the other pueblos greater harm, so that the expedition might proceed more peacefully. Right. Moving on. After Arenal, the surviving Tiwa took refuge in the mesa fortress of Moho. The siege lasted 80 days, from January to March, over 2.5 months. The Spanish stormed the walls. The Tiwa fired from the rooftops with bows and hurled stones from slings. They were so desperate for water that they dug a well. Castaneda. In the end, they dug a very deep well, but it collapsed, killing 30 people. On a cool March night, the survivors, parched, starved after 80 days, attempted an escape toward the river. The sentries detected them. 80 days on a rock, and they were caught at the last moment. Shawian, the chief the Spanish called Juan Aleman, shielded women and children with his body against the gunfire. He died. Nearly all the men with him. This is not an abstraction. This is 500 people, men, women, children, after 80 days on a rock, without water, with the dead in the collapsed well shaft, and a March night, and the run toward the river, and the shots. When it was over, 12 or 13 Tigre pueblos lay in ruins, or stood empty. Indian casualties numbered in the hundreds. And after all of it, in the spring, Coronado marched east, after El Turco, toward Quivira. The 23rd of April the following year, the entire army sets out from Tigre heading east. El Turco points the direction, always east. Here we return to the Great Plains where we began, but with full context. These men know what they are looking for. They know where they have come from. The burned pueblos, the people burned at the stake. They ride after a liar because the alternative, admitting failure, is worse than the lie. 8 days after crossing the Pecos River, the first bison herds. Castaneda described those animals through the eyes of someone who has no words for them. He used the word vacas, cows, because he had nothing better. Curly hair like a ram's wool, very thin on the hindquarters, silky as a lion's mane on the chest and neck, horns short and thick, barely visible through the fur. Horses bolted at the sight of them. The Spanish were simply terrified. Herds. Coronado wrote to the king, "There was not a day that I lost sight of them." There is a detail Castaneda recorded with astonishment and could not explain. Every old bison they killed had its left ear slit open. Young ones were intact. He never understood why. And then, when startled herds stampeded in blind panic into deep ravines, the animals filled those chasms with their bodies so quickly and so tightly that the rest of the herd ran across to the other side, stepping on the trampled, the living, and the dead. 2 days after the bison, the querechos. People living in tents of bison hide, the first European description of a conical Indian tent. Castaneda. Their houses were made of the skins of cows, tanned white like pavilions or army tents. They ate raw bison meat, drank blood from bottles made of bison intestine worn around the neck. And one more thing, because Castaneda recorded it with visible disgust and fascination in equal measure. When they open the belly of a cow, they squeeze out the chewed grass and drink the juice that remains, saying it contains the essence of the stomach. Clothing, tents, belts, ropes, everything from a single animal. Farther east, canyons, probably near the modern border of New Mexico and Texas. The Tayas, another plains people. In one of those canyons, a hailstorm. Castaneda. Stones fell as big as bowls. They smashed tents, shattered pottery, wounded horses. And right there, the Tayas confirmed what Sopete had been saying for weeks. Quivira exists to the north. El Turco is leading the army southeast, into nothing. Coronado makes a decision. He sends the main army back to Tiguex under the command of Tristan de Luna y Arellano, an experienced officer. You cannot feed 300 men on the prairie. He himself takes 30, in one account 40, horsemen. He rides on northward, with a compass. Castaneda. They followed the needle of the compass. 30 men in armor, 3,000 kilometers from home, guided by Sopete because El Turco is in chains. Northward. 77 days of marching through wilderness, so Coronado reported to the king, and the prairie erased them. Castaneda. They traveled for 8 days across those plains, where finding direction is like being at sea, for there is no stone, tree, shrub, or anything that might serve as a landmark. And the grass. Wherever they passed, the grass, though trampled, straightened up again as if no one had ever touched it. By the way, if any of you have ever been to Kansas or Oklahoma, well, you know. I have not been there myself, but the Flints describe that prairie in central Kansas, and there is a photo in their book, page 230-something, I do not remember exactly, where they stand in a field, and the horizon stretches 360 degrees. Not a single tree, nothing. Nowhere, nothing. Castaneda was not exaggerating. On the same page they mentioned that local farmers still find 16th century horseshoes and lead crossbow bolts in their fields. And that is that, just a detail, back to the main story. 2 riders went out hunting and were lost for 2 days. One of them, when found, said he had been riding in circles. 100 meters from camp and he could not find it. Hence the piles of bison bones as trail markers. Hence mounds of dung instead of milestones. Hence the Franciscan from the opening, circling 100 meters from the tents until someone fired a harquebus and blew a horn. At last, toward the end of July, a river. The Arkansas. In western Kansas, roughly where Dodge City stands today. Then northeast along the bank 3 days. Quivira. Central Kansas along the Arkansas River. Historians argue about the precise location. Grass huts. Round, dome-shaped houses on pole frames, covered in thick layers of prairie grass. Up to 200 houses in a single settlement, 25 such settlements. And you know what? Beautiful probably in their own way, but not when you are looking for gold and you have 2 years of marching and 2,000 kilometers behind you. The Wichita Indians, the same people Sir Pete had been talking about for months, being one of them himself. Coronado had them measured, over 2 meters tall. Fine. He probably picked the tallest to make the report look more impressive. They farmed corn and beans. They walked around nearly naked, and Coronado noted this with surprise, though he himself at that point was wearing armor in which he had been cooking for weeks. No gold, no bells, the only metal in the entire province, a copper pendant hanging from the chief's neck. I did not see any other metal in these parts other than this and some small copper bells. And then in the same letter to the king he writes the sentence of a man trying to save himself. The country itself is the best I have ever seen for growing all the products of Spain, for the soil in itself is very rich and black, well watered by streams and rivers. I found plums like those of Spain, nuts and good sweet grapes. The desperate footnote of a bankrupt. El Turco confesses. Castaneda. He admitted the whole plan was an operation devised by the leaders of Pecos Puebla. Lead the Spanish into the wilderness and lose them there. Let them starve. Let the Plains Indians get the horses. He invented the stories about gold because he saw that the Spanish reacted to metal like addicts to a drug. In Quivira, El Turco tried to persuade the residents to kill the horses at night, a final act of desperation. The execution, at night, in secret. Jaramillo. A guard was placed around him, and that night he was strangled with a garrote so that he did not wake the next morning. No trial. The new laws of the Indies, the regulations that for the first time in imperial history were meant to protect natives from slavery and exploitation, would not be proclaimed for another year. Coronado erected a wooden cross with an inscription, "Here arrived the General Francisco Vazquez de Coronado." Jaramillo confirms it.
Chapter 8. The Return.
Coronado spent 25 days in Quivira. He returned to Tigüey in early October. Castaneda. The soldiers came back poorly clothed and covered in lice, fantasizing about the riches they might have found had they continued. A second winter in the Rio Grande Valley, in the ruined pueblos, among people whose neighbors they had burned at the stake a few months earlier. Here something happens that changes Coronado. December, a horse race. Coronado races Captain Rodrigo Maldonado, unclear why, maybe a holiday, maybe boredom, maybe the need to feel he still controls something. Full gallop, the saddle girth snaps. Castaneda adds it must have been rotten, because who would bother checking gear after 2 years of marching? Coronado falls. Maldonado's horse steps over him. A hoof strikes his head. Castaneda. He fell to the side on which Don Rodrigo was riding, and as Maldonado's horse passed over him, it struck him on the head with its hoof, which brought him to the brink of death, and his recovery was slow. When he regained consciousness, he was changed. He began obsessively returning to an old prophecy by some astrologer at the University of Salamanca, who had supposedly foretold that he would become a great lord in distant lands, but would suffer a fall from which he would never recover. A man lying on a bed in a ruined pueblo along the Rio Grande, with a fractured skull, recalling a fortune told in his student days. Tejada, the judge the crown later sent to hold Coronado accountable for the entire expedition, reported to the king, "Vazquez de Coronado is much diminished in capacity. It is said this is from a fall from his horse. He is better suited to being governed than to governing another's province." Rumors circulated that Coronado faked relapses, that the injury gave him an alibi. Maybe. Sometimes a fall from a horse is just a fall from a horse. Spring of 1542. The army marches south. Of roughly 350 Europeans, 100 came back. As for the fate of the Franciscans who stayed behind, little is known, but what is known is bleak enough. Fray Juan de Padilla, the friar who had accompanied the expedition from the start as chaplain, returned to Quivira to Christianize the Wichita. He died there, killed by a hostile tribe. Fray Luis de Escalona stayed in Pecos. Fray Juan de la Cruz in Tigües, killed in November of the same year. Mexico. Viceroy Mendoza receives Coronado coldly. The residencia, a mandatory audit every senior official had to undergo at the end of a term. In Castilian law, it was a control mechanism. A special judge gathered testimony from witnesses, reviewed finances, examined Indian complaints. Sounds reasonable until you realize who was judging whom. Judge Tejada, the same man who led the investigation against Coronado, was in a separate case accused by Indians of having ordered 24,000 natives to plant grapevines in his private garden for starvation wages. Colonial law was a whip for conquistadors, not a shield for Indians. Coronado fined 600 pesos, removed from the governorship, cleared of the main charges. He had friends in the Audiencia, the colonial Supreme Court. The system worked for its own. The real scapegoat was Cardenas, the same Cardenas who saved Coronado at Hauicu, who discovered the Grand Canyon, who burned people at the stake in Arenal. He returned to Spain, where the Council of the Indies convicted him of war crimes. The only one convicted. Coronado lived another 12 years, a city councilman in Mexico City, quiet, forgotten. He died on the 22nd of September 1554 of some infectious disease the chronicles do not specify. Buried beneath the altar of the church of Santo Domingo. He was 44. Beatriz, his wife, later filed formal complaints in court claiming she was living in poverty. She wanted to block the enforcement of the new laws, which would strip her of the labor force from the encomiendas. Court records show their estate had not diminished at all.
Finale.
This story is not about Coronado. Coronado bet everything on one hand and lost. He threw in his fortune, his reputation, his health, 2 years of his life, and got mud villages and a sea of grass. It is about El Turco, a man without a name, Pawnee, Wichita, maybe someone from farther east, a captive of the Pecos Indians, then a captive of the Spanish. And I know how tempting it is to romanticize him, a hero who sacrificed his life for his people, a story worthy of a film. Maybe that is what happened. Or maybe El Turco simply lied to survive another day, and history caught up with him. Honestly, I do not have a verdict, and I probably should not. The only weapon he had was a story, and the knowledge of what the men holding his chains desired. Golden plates, bells in the wind, fish the size of horses, boats with golden eagles. And he drew it for them at night, in the sand. With that story he lured an army. 300 Spaniards, 1,000 allies, herds, supply trains, thousands of kilometers away from the pueblos those men had already started burning. Strangled at night with a garrote on the prairie somewhere in Kansas. No trial, no gravestone. The pueblos he drew them away from kept standing, damaged, with dead and abducted, but standing. The Zunis stood. Pecos stood for another 200 years. The Rio Grande Valley, the burned Tigues, the depopulated pueblos, that valley did not vanish. They survived until the Pueblo Revolt, 140 years later, when they threw the Spanish out for 12 years. The territories Coronado traversed, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Kansas, would not see another European for the next half-century. The next expedition, that of Juan de Oñate, a conquistador who would repeat many of the same mistakes, would not arrive until the end of the century. Coronado searched for the 7 cities of gold. He found clay, grass, and bison bones. Along the Arkansas River, somewhere in central Kansas, that wooden cross probably still lies, or whatever is left of it. Nobody has looked. And El Turco, with his story, bought his people time. And that is how the tale of the Golden Cities ends. Cities which, in my opinion, are out there somewhere. Maybe not exactly as El Turco described them, but the Spanish certainly did not manage to haul everything away before the jungle swallowed it. With new technology now, I think we have many discoveries still ahead. If you want to support the channel, I encourage you to join the channel membership on YouTube. I post long-form content without any ads, exclusively for members. Huge thanks to the current supporters. Without you, this channel would have fewer videos. If you enjoyed this, subscribe and like the video. If not, thank you all the same for listening to the end. Take care, and until the next one. Drop topics for future episodes in the comments. What do you want to hear about?